We've heard from many different scientists and brilliant people from academia in this podcast, and I couldn't be more excited to announce my very special guest for this episode, Dr. Tim Lewis. Tim and I chat about aggression from the lens of biology, and we take a deep dive into biological influences for aggression and why they matter in our work to understand and help dogs with aggression issues. Tim has a PhD in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and studies a wide range of animals from turtles to domestic dogs. His classes include the biology of dogs, ecology, neuroecology, natural history, and evolution. He's a professor of biology at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. An award-winning teacher, he gives talks about dog biology around the country. He recently published Dog Biology, From Gonads Through Guts to Ganglia, available in English and German. 2 border collies allow him to cohabitate in their home. And if you are enjoying the Bitey End of the Dog, you can support the podcast by going to aggressivedog.com, where there are a variety of resources to learn more about helping dogs with aggression issues, including the upcoming Aggression in Dogs Conference happening from September 29th through October 1st, 2023 in Chicago, Illinois, with both in-person and online options. You can also learn more about the Aggression in Dogs Master Course, which is the most comprehensive course available anywhere in the world for learning how to help dogs with aggression issues. Hey everyone, welcome to the Bitey End of the Dog. I've got Tim Lewis here this week. Tim has a PhD in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and studies a wide range of animals from turtles to domestic dogs. His classes include the biology of dogs, ecology, neuroecology, natural history, and evolution. He's a professor of biology at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. An award-winning teacher, he gives talks about dog biology all around the country. He recently published Dog Biology, From Gonads Through Guts to Ganglia, available in English and German. And he lives with 2 border collies that allow him to cohabitate in their home. Tim and I also spoke at the APDT conference together, so I'm very excited to jump in this conversation because we were talking about sort of looking at the inside and outside of a dog from a couple of different lenses that we're coming through. So welcome to the show, Tim.
Mike, thanks so much. I'm thrilled to be here. I love working with you when we were at APDT, and I love how you regularly incorporate science as a background and a lens to help guide behavior.
I appreciate it. There was a great presentation that we had together, lots of fun, and we got to kind of dissect what's happening from an aggression standpoint. So we can kind of dive into that during this show as well. So let's jump right into the topic of biology, because anybody who's listened to the show know I like to approach looking at behavior through different lenses. And I don't think we've had a biologist actually on the show. We've had lots of different other sciences and some that are close cousins to biology. But why do you think biology is so important in understanding, especially aggression in dogs and animals as well?
Yeah, it's probably the most fundamental question, and the reason I wrote the book that I did. When you are looking at a behavior, aggression or feeding or any behavior that you're looking at, you're seeing a complex result that has been programmed by genetics over millions of years, been impacted over the last several generations by epigenetics and environmental factors, is directly impacted by what the dog's, in this case, dog's background is and training, but also what's been happening in the last 24 hours and what its hormone situation is, as well as what it sees at the time. And it's so complex. But that background biology sets parameters and limits on what we do, gives us clues as to what tools to solve problems, and I think helps us know when a situation is significant or not significant. So I think, obviously I'm biased, but I think it's the most important lens to have when you're living with dogs or working with dogs.
Yeah. And I'm already loving how this is going to come out because you're speaking like a teacher and I'm just sitting there absorbing the information. So, and that's why I love doing these podcasts because I also learn so much. So let's dive into the brain now and the mechanisms happening there, because obviously that's an important part. And we've talked about it a little bit and from a neuroscience standpoint in other shows, but talk us through some of what's happening from a biological standpoint in a dog's brain.
Sure. So, I have to put a caveat here that neuroscience as a field is relatively new, came about in my career. The tools that make neuroscience work are new and ever growing, and the generalizations I'm going to make will probably, some of them be proved wrong even as we go along, because it's so complex. And to give you kind of a sense of that, this lump of matter inside our skulls takes in information from the outside world, has to process it through these neural networks that grow and change over time. And even between the nerves in that brain, there are chemical transmitters, neurotransmitters that affect how the signal is propagated from one neuron to the next. And you might have 1,000 connections on a neuron, and then you've got on the order of more connections, synapses, than there are stars in the known universe, building this complex pattern. So we talk about how the brain functions, and I'm going to make generalizations. We think about the brain as parts being specific locations, but often it's a network inside. The way I like to think about it is, the postal system in your city. Well, you got post offices, but you got delivery people. You got gas stations for the delivery vehicles. You've got paper makers, manufacturers for the paper that's going to go into this network is all connected, and your brain is the same way. So your brain is taking in sensory information. It's taking it in through the eyes, the ears, the nose for a dog, primarily one of the primary inputs for a dog, and putting those into patterns and doing pattern recognition and looking at how this fits the world around them. In its broadest sense, and I don't know if you want me to kind of, I want to, for what we're going to do later, I just want to describe two big systems and not get into all the parts. One of the systems would be the limbic system, and tied to that are two structures in the brain, the amygdala, that are kind of the security system for the brain, for the body. They're constantly checking inputs, saying, whoa, time's out. This one is significant. Deal with it. So that's your security system. And then you've got your prefrontal cortex and the cerebrum in general doing executive functions. I think of it like the administration. So at my university, we have administrators, we have a security team, we have a whole lot of other stuff going on, teachers and all that kind of stuff. For aggression, we're going to really want to be thinking about that limbic system, which is the security system, particularly the amygdala being the guards at the gate, and the prefrontal cortex largely as the executive functions, doing administrative work, planning ahead, doing budgets, all that kind of work.
I would love to weave a little bit of an example in here for the listeners to kind of visualize, everything we're going to be talking about. So since you have border collies, let's use a border collie. And we've got a dog. Let's say the border collie has issues with other dogs and we go out for walks. So what's happening first there? So they're seeing the other dog, maybe from a visual, maybe the other dog's too far away for that olfactory system to be in play at first, but they see the other dog, and we can argue that border collies are pretty vigilant about seeing things moving. Correct. And then, so what part of the brain first reacts if that dog has issues with other dogs?
Sure. So we're talking about my dog Blizzard. You just dredged him up. I miss that boy. And he was a border collie with issues. And when Blizzard would be out on a walk with me, he was more vigilant in his head movements to be scoping in the world, so visual. And his visual field, taking in information through his retina, going back to the visual cortex in the brain, pattern recognition. Do I see any shape that looks like a dog? Do I see any shape that looks like a person? That shape looks like a tree? We don't worry about it. That shape looks like the road. I don't worry about it. But as soon as a pattern would fit the dog, now the brain starts processing, is that a close threat? Is that a faraway threat? Is the dog pointed to me? Again, that pattern recognition and visual field. And as soon as it hits any of the criteria for the amygdala, like it's too close, it's threatening me, it's doing standard threat postures. For Blizzard, it didn't need for the other dog to give you anything standard. It just needed the other dog to exist. So as soon as his pattern recognition was dog, his amygdala was like, time's out. And what that does when you get the amygdala involved, it short circuits the signals away from the prefrontal cortex, takes the administration out. So beforehand, the administrative functions are going, road, trees, who cares? A bird may be interesting. As soon as it's a dog, and when Blizzard would see that dog, that would be a threat. Amygdala kicks in, prefrontal cortex is out of it, and he goes into a more hard patterned response that's built into the deep memories in his brain, and the what we often call muscle memory in the cerebellum takes over, and he gives some standard responses, in his case, moving right into aggressive posturing.
And that sends signals to the rest of the body, right? And so what is happening there? We hear about parasympathetic, sympathetic. Can you dive into that?
Sure. So in addition to your brain is connected to the world, right? You see your eyes, you know, okay, there's a connection to my brain, but scattered throughout your body, you've got nerves all over. And broadly writ, there's a system to kind of be a gas pedal, speed things up to arouse. That's the sympathetic nervous system, connects to most parts of the internal organs and the brain. And you have a parasympathetic, that's like the brakes, calming things down. So as Blizzard is seeing these other dogs, it is kicking in his sympathetic nervous system, which does a mosaic of things. It slows down digestion. It focuses the brain on what's immediately in front, and the brain starts processing, are we going to fight, are we going to flee? But that system is not just nervous. It also kicks out a lot of chemicals, hormones, that come from different parts of the body. For example, once that sympathetic system is stimulated, you've got the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys, have nothing much really to do with the kidneys, but they're sitting right there. They're kicking out chemicals like cortisol, like adrenaline, that just flood the whole body, so you get a whole body-wide response. So we've got the nervous system interacting with this hormone system that's just cascading and having physiological effects throughout the body.
And there you have it, folks. That's one of the reasons why a lot of dogs don't take food when they usually would in a particular situation, right? It's because of the change in what's happening in the systems.
Right. Appetite changes completely when you flood with those hormones.
And can you talk more about, so, we have dogs that might see something and perceive a threat differently than humans. So why is that? Is there something happening different between like a human brain and kind of assessing a threat versus a dog's brain?
Okay, how many hours do you want me to go on that one? So at its most basic, I would want people to understand that all mammals have very similar brains. And they're very similar in the parts, the stem that runs the heartbeat and the breathing, the limbic system, which runs emotions. The more research data we get on things as diverse as rats and dogs, people, we see that they're all pretty well laid out the same. So this emotional part, the most evolutionary old part, is probably pretty similar. We have every reason to think your dog is feeling the same suite of emotions you can feel, broadly writ. What's different in the dog's brain is that cortex, that layer that does associative processing, is much smaller, orders of magnitude smaller than what our cortex does. So for example, Mike, if I say, think of bread, you can go to I don't know, what's your favorite kind of bread?
Something crusty, maybe.
Something crusty?
Yeah.
Okay, tell me about a place you've had crusty bread.
Panera.
Panera, okay. Can you picture a Panera?
Absolutely, yeah.
Can you hear it and smell it? Mm-hmm. Can you see anybody else in that Panera in your mind's eye?
Yeah.
Okay, you just did multiple layers of association on and on deeper. So when you smell that crusty bread, somewhere in the part of your brain, the Panera is there, but maybe your mom baked you bread at some point. Maybe somebody threw a loaf of bread at you at some point. You're doing all those complex associations. Your dog doesn't have anywhere near the ability to do that, those complex associations. They're probably doing much simpler. Bread, like bread. I'm going to go eat that. It's much more immediate, same kind of emotional response, but without the associated 17 layers of memory going 72 steps out that we have. So much more immediate time and effect.
So would I be correct in kind of saying that it's just they have a hard time rationalizing in a sense? I guess that's maybe the wrong choice of word, but let me give you an example. Maybe that'll be more helpful. Like a dog that's on an invisible fence collar, right? And sees the mail carrier or something that elicits them to go towards that particular person or animal, whatever it is. And then they receive the stimulus of the beep or the shock from the collar. But then whatever they're looking at, could be a garbage can or a bush or something like that. And then suddenly the dog has paired that association. Whereas humans could be kind of rational about it. It's not the bush, it's actually the collar because I'm walking towards it. But dogs quickly, in many cases, latch on to some other part of the environment.
So
does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. We do the same thing. A really interesting study done on learning that if you, for example, suck on peppermint candy while you're learning, you the human, not the dog, you will associate some of your memories with that peppermint candy. And later, if you were, say, taking an exam, if you were sucking on peppermint candy, you would make some associations of the things you learned to the candy, which has no relevance whatsoever. We tag things in our own brain in odd ways as well. But what you said, the rationalization part, that's what's different. We can relearn it. We can go, no, that's not relevant. I don't need the peppermint candy. I can associate it with something else. And for a dog, it's often hard to unlearn that. So I had a dog, Gromit, who playing in our backyard, saw a squirrel come down a tree. And that squirrel taunted Gromit for 2 or 3 minutes, just out of reach of Gromit. At that time, he was maybe 3 years old, until he moved away from that house. When we moved him away from the house, 8 years later, he couldn't pass that tree without stopping and looking for that squirrel. It never extinguished the association. So as you say, they make an association, and it becomes really hard to get them off that association because their brain doesn't have 17 layers going on of the associations. It's just last time or a very significant time. And evolutionarily, that makes a lot of sense. If something is significant enough to get written into your brain and you're living out there in the wild, you want to keep that because odds are it worked before, it was relevant, it's going to be relevant now.
That you kind of answered some of my next question there, but it's when a dog is seeking safety or something significantly threatening in the environment, they latch on to that particular association. Is it more prevalent because of that? So I guess I should clarify that. It means like the dog is much more likely to latch on to some other stimulus in the environment versus some other activities that they might be doing that they don't perceive as significant threat to their own safety.
Yeah, let me take the scientific cop out. I haven't seen a study that actually looked at that, and I'm not quite sure how we'd measure it. Mm-hmm. Having said that cop out, everything you said makes sense, is reasonable, but there are lots of things that would be difficult to test about that kind of conclusion. It's one of the limits of science, but it's also probably the most common thing I get asked. Does this mean this, or does my dog do this? And the answer is maybe, because we'd need to run a nice controlled study to do that. And the study you're describing would have to have the dogs in a functional MRI to do that. But it seems reasonable.
We'll get on that, Tim. Let's go. Yeah. To see some more research.
Here's my grant request for a couple $1 million for some functional MRI time.
So on the opposite side, though, as behavior consultants and trainers, we're often trying to pair positive associations to undo a negative one. And would you say it's why it takes so much longer? Because it's not as powerful in terms of the associations in some cases.
The best I can do here is to think evolutionarily, right? Things that, assuming the worst and being wrong, you're alive either way. Failing to assume the worst when you should have, you're dead. And so there's strong evolutionary pressure to err on the side of remembering what worked to keep you alive and healthy in the past rather than unlearning it. So if I have a bad association, but I survived it, whatever that association is, there'd be strong evolutionary pressure to hang on to that because it kept me alive last time. You don't have time in an organism for a controlled experiment. I don't know what that bell ringing had to do with keeping me alive when that other dog was walking by, but my God, it worked. So I'm going to keep that association. It's safer to keep those hard associations that you perceived dangerous situations than to just let them go easily. So you're fighting a strong evolutionary pressure to move things to the positive associations.
And that's why it's sometimes so resilient to changing that, because it's such an ingrained memory, I guess,
right.
is what's happening there. Now, talk us through some again. I just want to jump back to the hormone aspect, and let's use that border collie example. And so we have these hormones in play. And then a real hot topic right now, too, in the dog training world is resiliency. So the animal's ability to cope with stress. Mm-hmm. So talk us through that. Let's say this border collie, what's happening from the hormonal aspect? And then why might it take some dogs much longer to recover from a stressful event?
Yeah, so I'm going to go right into the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland complex, the HPA complex, which is where some really fun, interesting research is going on right now. What that is a specific set of pathways that are associated with what we're talking about right now, which just includes stress responses. Okay, so the hypothalamus is a structure in the brain that, amongst other things, takes nerve inputs from the brain and converts them to hormone chemical inputs that then go right next door to the pituitary gland, and there's 2 lobes in the pituitary, sends a chemical signal to them, and then they send a chemical signal out to the whole body, okay? So it's the place where you're converting brain, neural, chemical to hormones that go throughout the body. And one of the places these hormones get into the blood, they get picked up by the adrenal gland, for example, for the HPA complex, get picked up by the adrenal gland that says, oh, criminy, we got a problem here and we need to deal with it. The interesting evidence that's out there right now is that puppies and young dogs that get aroused and then brought back down and aroused and brought back down more frequently, that practice the dampening that system, do better throughout life, dampening that system. And so early training gets the brain hormone complex to respond more quickly into that calming position. And it's really cool because it's you're wiring the brain of the juvenile dogs to build in resiliency. And that then becomes useful throughout life. So we're seeing how it functions and how training early on adds to resiliency later.
I have many questions. I love this topic. I love this topic. So it sounds like it's more difficult, obviously, to build resiliency later on in life when
that seems to be the evidence. And it's true of humans too, right? You're early on for mammals, it's a great period of learning. Your evolutionary advantages, you learn things quickly or you don't stay alive. But once you've learned them, if you've managed to stay alive this long, that added brain resiliency is a lot of extra energy without a whole lot of extra gain for most out there in the evolutionarily relevant world, not in our backyards. So the brain is adapted to learn and rewire more and quickly younger. Now, learning happens throughout life. It's just you're making more of those connections. In fact, in the brain, there are pre-connections that are close and ready to go early in life. There are more of those. Those result in rapid learning and rapid synapse construction. And later in life, there are fewer of those preset synapses that are ready to go for quick learning. So yeah, it's what you experience and do early has long-term impacts, not just on what you remember, but on how quickly you can learn those things.
So I have a follow-up question to that, but I first want to define arousal. So you mentioned arousal a little bit, a couple of times, but your elevator pitch for what arousal is, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions or different definitions for that in the dog training community.
And so when I'm talking arousal as a biologist, I'm talking about engaging the sympathetic nervous system, which leads to what we would classically call fight or flight type responses to adapt the body for what could be trauma or confrontation. I know trainers use arousal in a lot of different ways. So when I'm talking arousal, I'm really talking about physiological changes and neurological changes that come associated with the sympathetic nervous system. That's not going to be exactly what you would use in your normal nomenclature. Is that right?
That sounds good. I like it because it definitely is a definition that I've seen all kinds of different talk about. And sometimes it's even like a 4-letter word, like, arousal is a bad thing, but actually, we have to talk about it and understand.
And I get asked that even like if I'm at a, an agility trial or something and people say, I'm just trying to get my dog aroused. And I'm like, that doesn't mean the same thing to you as it does to me. Or was my dog aroused in that situation? I'm like, are you asking, are they more aware, or are you asking, was the sympathetic system engaged? And that's a different question too.
So I'm sure people listening be like, Tim, this sounds great. So what am I going to do with my puppy? Am I going to dunk them in like an ice bath? Like we see social media, people doing that to build stress resilience. Like what are some things going through your mind as far as, people saying, okay, I want to build resiliency. I want to have a stress resilient pup that develops in a dog that can handle situations later in life. What does that look like for you?
Yeah. So there's some interesting, the caveat first, I'm a scientist with dogs. So I work with dogs and I train my dogs. I am not a professional dog trainer, right? So I can talk to you about the biology of what's going on, and a dog trainer needs to be able to say, that's what that would look like in this setting, or that's what that would look like with this dog. So in the arousal, in that juvenile, in that puppy stage during that first year, and when I say during the first year, I don't have data that says for sure it's I want to be careful about like learning periods, and somebody's going to go, well, Tim said first year, and I'm one day past the first year. And that's not what I'm talking. I'm just saying in that younger period of life, practicing arousal and coming down from it. And it can be, you can get the sympathetic system engaged with toys, just getting some high activity going, and a dog tugging on the toys or catching a Frisbee or something like that, and getting them aroused. And then, whoop, we're stopping right now, and rewarding the calming with, positive reinforcement as the dog calms down, so that you're practicing getting the system aroused and then bringing it back down to a normative state. That is really important practice right now. So I know people very well who believe that the most important thing to do with a juvenile dog is just to keep it busy all the time so it's tired at the end of the day. You're never letting it learn arousal. You're never engaging that HPA complex, which gets involved and helps calm the dog down. I have 2 border collies. I have had 5 border collies, all with on-off switches, right? People talk about border collies. Oh, they can never calm down. Sure they can. You teach them early to calm down. It just turns out that the physiology behind that is this HPA complex. Practice it. You practice arousal and you practice calming down.
I can get inside some of my listeners' minds right now, and that they're thinking maybe like there's some classic exercise like go wild and freeze, or playing tug with the dog and then stopping, or playing some sort of high sort of arousing activity in their mind, meaning getting sort of like you were talking about in the sport dog world, and then freezing, getting the dog to pause. Is that kind of what you're thinking of?
That's exactly the kinds of things, and lengthening the pause time so that the dog more and more learns to have an off time. But absolutely, it's to move away from I have to have my dog's brain stimulated all the time to, I have to teach it to be able to be stimulated and calm down.
Mm-hmm. Now, how would that tie into getting the dog more acclimated to provocative stimuli? So things that might scare the dog, or we want the dog to, so novel stimuli, something like garbage cans on a windy day moving around on the street. So our border collie example again might have missed that early on, but let's say we could start over again with that border collie and get it better with the garbage cans. There's a fine balance, right? Because we don't want to overexpose or flood the dog, but at the same time we want to sort of habituate the dog to the environment.
So, yeah, and I think there's 2 parts there, right? So you want to habituate the dog to whatever noises are common in the environment so that they learn that these noises are just part of the background. The more you have physiologically, so learning involves brain changes. Whenever I say learning, we're talking about new synapses, we're talking about new neural pathways, right? When you have trained the dog to calm down in those exercises, you are working with the HPA complex to build that pathway in. And that's going to help. All evidence so far is that's going to help with, I heard the loud, unexpected noise. How quickly can I get back down to a base level? It's going to help improve the time, reduce the time from being aroused and concerned about the environment to now I can go back to normal functioning.
Mm-hmm. I want to jump more into this topic in just a moment, but I'm going to take a short break to hear a word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back with Tim. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you are enjoying this episode. I have a very special offer that I'm announcing just before the Aggression in Dogs conference this year. You've heard me talk about the Aggression in Dogs Master Course on this podcast, and for a limited time to celebrate the 4th annual Aggression in Dogs conference, I'm going to be launching a bundle offer that includes the course and all 19 webinars available on aggressivedog.com. Yes, that's all of the webinars. The webinars alone would typically cost more than $580 to purchase together, but I'm including them for free in this special bundle deal with the Aggression in Dogs Master Course. Just some of the topics for the webinars include how to break up a dog fight, assessing canine posture and movement, the genetics of aggression, dog-to-cat aggression, dog-to-child-directed aggression, and treat and retreat with some of the most respected behavior pros in our field, including Suzanne Clothier, Grisha Stewart, Dr. Amy Cook, Dr. Christina Spalding, Laura Monaco Torelli, Jen Shryock, Trish McMillan, and Dr. Jessica Heckman, just to name a few. You're going to receive all 19 webinars, the master course, live group mentor sessions with me, and access to the private Facebook group, a value of over $2,700, all for just the price of the master course, which is $495. There's only going to be 50 bundles available in this offer, and I'm going to drop a link to the bundle in the show notes for this episode. The offer is going to expire on October 8th, 2023. That's October 8th, 2023, which is just 1 week after the conference. Though the bundle typically sells out quickly, so please take advantage if you are interested. Head on over to the show notes for this episode in the podcast platform you are listening to, and click on the Aggression in Dogs Master Course and Expert Webinar Bundle link. I also want to take a moment to support Sindhor Pangal, who's going to be speaking at the Aggression in Dogs conference this year. Sindhor shared the story of an organization doing truly amazing work to help animals. Charlie's Animal Rescue Center, CARE, or CARE for short, is an animal shelter providing timely medical aid to injured and ill animals of the streets in Bangalore City. They aim to provide life-saving veterinary care on par with private veterinary setups to all animals, irrespective of their ownership status. CARE has a rescue helpline, animal ambulance services, and a fully equipped veterinary trauma care unit. CARE strives to provide dignity to animals who are old, blind, paraplegic, and suffering from chronic diseases, and allow them to live out their lives at the shelter in a safe and peaceful environment. CARE is home to many dogs, cats, rabbits, ducks, hens, pigs, guinea pigs, birds, and even terrapins. No animal left behind is their main motto. Apart from rescue and shelter services, CARE also provides adoption services, humane education in schools, animal cruelty prevention and control, and volunteering opportunities. You have to check out their Instagram channel where you can see all the wonderful work they are doing to care for and save dogs and animals in need. Their Instagram handle is Charlie's Animal Rescue Center, and that center is spelled CENTRE. So it's Charlie's Animal Rescue Center. You've got to check out that Instagram account. It's really wonderful work they're doing. Please consider donating to this wonderful cause. You can do that directly through their website at charlies-care.com. That's charlies-care.com. I'm going to be sure to drop a link in the show notes for both their Instagram and a way to donate. All right, welcome back. We're here with Dr. Tim Lewis. We're talking about biology and aggression, and we were taking a deep dive into hormones and resilience right before the break. So I'd love to kind of keep going in that direction. What influences aggression really, and how that differs also? So, we can take many deep dives into the different lenses, but if you had, let's say biologists, neuroscientist, ethologist, behaviorist walk into a bar, right? And we'll go from there. But so when we see aggression, let's use that border collie again. We talked about, the impacts of maybe lack of resilience or learning those things early on. And what else, when you're talking through a lens of biology, what else is going to impact that dog's future likelihood for aggression?
So I get asked a lot this general question, what contributes to aggression? I have a list of 18 items that contribute to aggression. Do you want me to go through that list?
Let's do this. Yes.
Okay. So first, some framing. The list is not meant to be long to make you throw up your hands and say, there's 18 things that affect aggression. I can't affect them. You have very good ability as trainers to affect a few of these, and you should be aware of the others because they come into play. Okay, so this should not be despair, 18 items, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So Tim's list of 18 items that affect aggression and what you can do about them. And the first one is the genetics of the dog, right? There's tons of growing body of evidence. There's tons of evidence out there about the different behavioral aspects, sociability, for example, or aggression, and the genetics that are associated with those broadly writ that we don't do much about, right? We could put most of the dog behaviorists out of business if we spent time on really careful breeding for 10 or 15 generations. I've heard different people estimate. My estimate is 10. Yeah, it's a shot in the dark. We know from 20 generations you can turn a wild thing like a fox into a cuddly dog that sits on your lap. If we paid more attention to genetics, we would be way ahead of the curve in all of these situations. I have a friend who bred a border collie, and the sire in this case was a herding border collie, and the bitch was a very sociable, good agility dog, but known to have good off switch, really good people orientation. And the herding instructor who knew this particular bitch said, well, what a waste of a breeding, because the dog won't be wanting to herd all the time, won't be a champion herder. We often go for those extremes. I want the best fly ball. I want the best herder. I want the best guard dog. I want the best. And we forget the dog's going to live with us a long time, and we don't pick good genes. So first and foremost, thinking about the genetic line and thinking about the behavior of the dog rather than just the looks, the breed, or the activity that I want. I would do weeks just talking about that. It's not what anybody wants to do, and it's not what many people want to do, but good genes. Now, it turns out as that DNA gets coated with on-off switches, DNA is what's in every cell. It's the blueprint that runs how your body develops. There are on-off switches that are affected by certain molecules, and the environment, so a high-stress environment, for example, can load the DNA with certain off switches on some genes and on switches with others. It's a way for the organism to be able to be quickly adapted to a changing environment. The study of this is called epigenetics, and we know it goes back at least 2 generations. And it goes back 2 generations because the egg for the puppy that was born today was inside the bitch her entire time since she was an embryo, sitting inside her mom. So the grandmother of the puppy born, the environment she's in affects how the DNA are played out 2 generations later. So you want item number 2 is to make sure that the grandmother had a great environment. And people say, well, what does that mean? I'm like, I don't know, because we don't know what makes for the perfect environment. But we know the grandmother's environment matters, and that means the mother's environment matters. We also know the uterine environment matters. If you're a singleton, you get bathed with different amount of hormones than, say, if you're a male puppy surrounded by 2 female embryos, or a female surrounded by 2 male embryos. So as you're dealing with aggression, you want to have a good uterine environment. You want to make sure your neighbors are right. Females tend to lower the aggression, and males to increase just because of the testosterone. So a litter of 3 or 4 or 5 males would have a very different uterine chemical environment, which would affect the behavior of the dogs that come out of it. So that's item 4, is to have a good uterine environment. We know the neonatal environment, the early birth environment, is really important. I've heard 20 or 30 different recipes of this is the perfect neonatal environment. The data on it are not as clear cut, but you definitely need a good neonatal environment. Low stress, moderate stress kinds of things are probably going to turn out to be better. So a low stress, moderate set of experiences in that neonatal environment. Good neonatal health care, because the health of the organism affects all the hormones in the body and the brain development. So you want to have good neonatal health care. A good pre-adult environment, again, with enough stimulus for learning and arousal opportunities and calm down opportunities. And that's environment and healthcare, as well as the learning environment. I distinguish those as 2 different ones. Good adult health care in your dog, because we know lots of negative impacts that come from bad health, from pain, from hormone imbalances. Good adult learning environment that keeps the brain stimulated and learning. And then in an area that's it's exciting and we don't know exactly how it's going to play out, you need a good gut biome. We know that the microflora and fauna, the bacteria and fungi in the intestinal tract and in the stomach and in the mouth and in the throat affect behavior. Now we're just starting to tease it out, but we know it has impacts, and you change that environment. So what I tell people is the best guess right now is a good varied diet, so that the bacteria and fungi in there are themselves getting a good diet. You have to think of feeding the microbiome as well as feeding the dog. And then at the time, some aggressive thing, like I'm taking Blizzard for a walk, what has he been doing for the last 24 hours? Has it been low stress? because that's going to affect the hormones. And some of these hormones don't clear for 24 hours. So something like adrenaline functionally is pretty clear after about a dozen hours. But if my dog was in a high stress environment 6 hours ago, that's going to affect what's happening right now. Blizzard on a morning walk when he hadn't been exposed to other things that got him worried was calmer and less likely to get into that stress response. But once he'd gotten into that stress response, man, now he's ready to click into it all the time. And then we want to have the glucocorticoids that are coursing through the body. We want those to be a low amount. We want positive experiences in the seconds before whatever stressor's coming, like you can control. Now we're getting into stuff you can control, right? Mm-hmm. You can look at your dog and say, okay, I can give him a better environment for the next 6 hours before we go outside. And then I can visually be in that environment and help make sure it's a low stress environment. And then for about 0.8 of a second, you have no control. That's when the amygdala kick in. And you have no control of it. Just recognize that for that 0.8 of a second, what the dog is going to do is what it's been deep-seated trained to do, right? And we can retrain a dog so that its amygdala response is different than just bite. But the training where that happens is the kind of training that dogs go through, like at a police academy training, where it's 8 weeks of intensive, nonstop training. It takes that to reprogram that 0.8 of a second amygdala response, right? So your dog can learn some other, when the amygdala kicks in, I'm going to do something different, but it takes an enormous amount of time for that to happen. And then what happens right after the stressing event? Because that's going to reinforce the next one. If my dog growls and the stressor goes away, man, I've just reinforced that such a positive way that that's going to be hard to stop it in the next environment. And then what you do over the next couple of minutes that get brought into the learning. So what's biologically? We've got to go everything from DNA to hormones to learning. And then what's hardwired, that's been really heavily programmed into that amygdala response, and then how we reinforce it right after the event. And that's a really hard one, right? Because you and I talked about that before. You're reinforcing that the dog bites, somebody runs off, dog's like, hey, that worked.
Many questions, but I love that. I love how you went through those, and so many things. I was going through my head too. I'm like, I'm going to be out of a job probably in 20 years when the technology catches up. So I actually am dealing with this at just about the right time, because I think things are going to rapidly change in advance as we learn more about all those things you were talking about, the biomes and tinkering with genetics. And
if you had a gut biome biologist on right now, they would know more than me, and they would say, okay, but we know these strains do this and these strains do that. They are doing some really exciting work on it.
It's fascinating stuff. Dr. Amber Batson was talking about it a couple seasons ago in the show. And I also want to give a shout out to Dr. Jessica Hexman's Functional Breeding, the site Functional Breeding, because she's talking about a lot of these things in how we can really change dogs for the better in terms of, focusing on not just looks, but, the health, the behavior, all of those things we were talking about. So just to jump back to the in utero aspect, we've talked about it sometimes on the show about how the mother experiences certain stressors. Maybe, let's say, a dog that is out on the street somewhere in a very poor environment, how much that can impact the puppies. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So let me set a scenario. This will be a simplistic way to think about it. Imagine with my DNA, if I can have a set of DNA that works in high stress environments and a set of DNA that's for calm environments, right? So that would mean that all the litter offspring that I have were in that same kind of environment. And a high stress environment from a biological point of view means high competition for resources. Maybe there's a high population of conspecifics. If I'm a wolf in the wild, it's other wolves in the wild. Am I in a food rich or food poor environment? Or do we have extreme weather? Those kind of things. And having a set of genes that works in one environment and a set of genes that work in the other, you got them both in the DNA. Now all you got to do is be able to turn one on or the other on, and it's good for the life of that offspring, right? So a mom who was herself an embryo in a high stress environment, but all of her offspring are in a low stress, all of her experiences are low stress, the epigenetic controls would allow a switch to a more subtle environment, which would allow those offspring to be more successful. That's what epigenetics is about, is like having two sets of instructions for complex situations and being able to turn them on or off, but not during the lifespan. It's the set you got for your whole lifespan. So the high stress environments would cause any embryos there to basically be anticipating, they don't really, I did that with air quotes, they can't anticipate anything, but to be anticipating a high stress outcome. And so they're going to have the high stress suite turned on. And then they come into my house out in the country where it's nice and quiet and calm, but the wrong set of genes are turned on.
Yeah. Yeah. And all of this is a really nice overview of why it's nature and nurture, right? That whole nature and nurture argument that we hear about, and not so much of an argument anymore, but we still hear it sometimes. It's all in how you raise them kind of viewpoint.
I want to jump in on that, and I apologize, but that's the whole reason we have a cerebral cortex. Because if you didn't need to learn from your environment, you could have a brain like a turtle that does, essentially very little associative processing or learning. It's pretty much what's all hardwired, and that works great for their environment. And I pick a turtle because I'm a turtle biologist and I've done a lot, but turtle brains are more complex than that. But let's just imagine if you didn't need to learn, there would be no value to it. The great mammalian addition is this cerebral cortex that allows you to learn anything that's in nature with enough deliberate learning. Almost anything. I can't say anything. Almost anything can be learned over, right? We can come to associate new behaviors with old stimuli with enough consistent training. That's what the cerebral cortex is for. So it's not nature nurture. It's, we're mammals. We can, through nurturing, change most every behavior. But that requires a lifetime of consistent, perfect situational control, which none of us have. But that's what your brain's for. That's what the cerebrum's for, so that it's both nature and nurture.
Well explained.
Off my soapbox.
Yes. No, well explained. And it has me thinking about also, so you're talking about the amygdala and the response there. Let's go back to our border collie example. So we have a dog that's maybe 100 yards away. Our border collie sees it and it's slowly approaching, and there's kind of time to process that, but there's still going to be an aggressive response at some point. And then versus we're going around a street corner and another dog suddenly is just right in that dog's face snarling. And so you're going to see different responses proportional to the threat. Is that what's happening? So I guess the question is, are we seeing a proportionate response from the amygdala, or is this something else happening? Is it the same measured response from the amygdala, but that then gets processed through something else that allows for the proportional response?
Sure. The amygdala is not simply an on-off, I've jumped in or not jumped in. And you experience that yourself, right? If I sneak up behind you and yell something in your ear, you respond in a very abrupt, sudden move. Whereas if I'm far away and you have time to, you can tell it's far away, everything's kind of ramped up slowly. So you get proportional responses. You get responses without the amygdala kicking in, right? So the border collie that sees the dog 100 yards away, the amygdala is probably just still snoozing because you're just taking it in. There's no threat. There's no immediate problem, but it's constantly evaluating the situation at some level, probably below the conscious level. Ooh, I just talked about consciousness in dogs. Let's just skip right over that.
I don't know if I'm going to let that one go, but I might have to jump into that.
You're getting proportional response. And once you trigger into the amygdala and you get that immediate fight or flight, that's kind of this buildup of awareness from different parts of the brain and setting the stage for the amygdala. So how aroused, how much your sympathetic system is involved in the first place sets, I hate this word because the dog community uses it differently, sets a lower threshold for response because I'm already aware that I'm in a high threat environment.
Let's jump into that word there a little bit too, because I think it's important. Actually, it's another term that gets tossed around, and dog trainers kind of define threshold often as the point at which the dog will start displaying undesirable behavior, like the barking, lunging. But from a biological lens, I understand it's different. So, explain.
Okay, I'm going to jump in first on that desirable and undesirable, and in fact, this is part of what I'm going to be talking about at the Aggression Conference in Chicago this fall. From a nature point of view, it's all good. Anything that increases reproductive fitness is good. We took a wolf doing superb in the environment with traits that were essential for survival in the environment, stick him in our house more in the last 50 years than certainly we've been doing this for 10,000 years of domestication, but, even my father-in-law used to comment, well, nobody would have a dog in the house. You wouldn't put a tractor in the house. You would never have a dog in the house. It's a tool. This influx in this last generation of humans that we're bringing them into our house and we're making them a part of it, but they've still got the tool set from being out in the wild. And you said, barking, and I don't remember the exact adjective you used, but it was a negative adjective. And from a dog's point of view, that's a pretty positive thing. There's a stress reduction with barking. It may keep away whatever scary thing it is. And I think it's useful when we're thinking about dogs and dog training is that we think that's bad, but to the dog, that was probably pretty good. And that makes it that gives it a little different. It's, my dog's not just being mean and stupid. He's doing something that's good and rewarding.
So
did I get to where you were going?
Kind of. And I want to unpack thresholds a little bit more.
Okay, that's right.
And then, again, like if you were to just define it, like if from a biological standpoint.
Yeah. So behaviorists would use threshold differently than so as an evolutionary ecologist who looks at behaviors from kind of their outcomes, the aggression responses are a sliding scale or a continuum. And you move to the next activity, if you will, on the list as the first one isn't working based on your kind of threat assessment. The only real threshold I would think of in terms biologically is, did the amygdala kick in? Did you kick in your fight or flight response? If the answer is no, you're on a gray scale or a continuum scale, and threshold doesn't have quite the same meaning because the change of the cortisol levels in the blood, it's not like they're there or they're not. It's at what level are they and how much of the nervous system is being stimulated, how much other organs are being stimulated. And it's kind of this continuum. And from an aggression point of view, and again, as an ecologist, I would use aggression probably differently than the dog community would, but there's a strong evolutionary pressure to minimize threat and contact, because that's dangerous. If I can get you to back down, back away, leave me alone, I save a lot of risk. And you don't want to put any more energy into that than you have to, because then any energy you put into that threat display is something you don't have for something else like reproduction or foraging or whatever. So there's strong evolutionary pressure to stay as low on the scale as you can and just work your way up. So not a threshold, it's, did I send you a signal? Did you get the signal? Did you understand I don't want this? Working your way up the line. Thresholds from a physiological point of view typically tend to be things that initiate a positive feedback loop. The one that's easiest to get most people to think about is, you're upset, you're a little bit angry with somebody, you get a little bit more upset, and then you just lose it and you lay into them with a bunch of words that later you regret. You hit a positive feedback loop that just escalated everything in your response. That would be the thresholds. Otherwise, threshold is biologically less important. And I'm going to say less important because what's going on in the brain is, in fact, all thresholds. Did the neuron get stimulated not just by one, but it might be 300 other synapses that pre-adapt that neuron to fire, or 500, or based on its learning, 50. And so every neuron firing is in fact a threshold, a positive feedback loop of enough neurotransmitters and enough synapses involved that cause an action potential to move down that neuron to the cell body and out the other side, out the axon, to affect the next nerve. And so at the neurological level, nothing exists without thresholds. So I kind of gave for the evolutionary and ecological, did you get enough to get behaviors? But what's going on in the brain is clearly at the cellular level, threshold level responses.
Oh, I'm so glad we jumped into this distinction, Tim, because I think it's so crucial for trainers and consultants observing behavior, not just threshold on their observation of overt behaviors like barking, lunging, growling, snarling, snapping, because the amygdala could be in action. When we don't see something, sometimes the dog's not going to be obvious about it. And so we have to be very prudent about paying attention to those micro signals that we might pick up, physiological signs, right?
And it's not always the amygdala, right? So your cerebrum is processing things from a distance, and being aware just those little tiny things, that little extra awareness in a direction, the ears got turned that way, a sniff that direction, whatever, that start to say, I'm paying attention over there. Now you're starting to go up that scale, right? Awareness is the first step. Until there is some level of awareness at the physiological or brain level, and those are separate things, right? It's hard, that's that consciousness that we're dodging and not going to talk about, right? You are responding constantly to your environment in ways that are moving you along that scale, that pre-amygdala even.
So this is a kind of a perfect segue into the topic of offensive versus defensive aggression, because we're kind of also talking about what's happening in the brain and how the dog might respond to that. So I'll give you the sort of trainer community definition of it, and then you tell me just how much that's accurate or not compared to a biological lens. So, when we talk about offensive, we're often saying the dog's being proactive. So like a dog let me give a good example. Well, let's use a defensive example first, because that'll be probably a better baseline. So defensive aggression would be something where a dog is, somebody's approaching it, trying to grab its collar, and the dog doesn't want to be touched. And so the dog responds by biting that person's hand, and because they're fearful of that person. Whereas offensive is sort of a more proactive approach to, I see a person approaching. They're not doing anything to me threatening. They're not trying to touch me, but I'm going to leave my property to go and bite them to make them go away. So the function is still to increase distance or eliminate the threat, but the overall observations are going to be different. So that's typically what I see in terms of the definition of it. What do you think of that?
So I'm going to break this differently than you, because when I think of offensive aggression, I think of predatory type things. And the predation response, aggression that you might call aggression, the word aggression in the behavior ethology kind of is basically any kind of interference with another conspecific or other around for a limited resource, right? So anything that interferes with another's ability towards those resources is a form of aggression. Predation is a dopamine learned reward behavior game, or so you have that. And then you have fight or flight. And once you get into fight or flight, this is the body's defense system. And you can then take the offense or the defense. And either of those, fighting can be offense and defense, and fleeing can be offensive or, mostly is defensive, right? But what the body's really doing is a functional decision about, am I orienting towards interfering with you with action versus I'm trying to get out of here. And from a evolutionary and physiological and brain network kind of thing, short of learning that offense and defense would, from this lens, would be defense is getting out of there, fight is offense, but then it takes different forms, right? I can fight aggressively, I hate that word, I shouldn't use it there. I can fight offensively, proactively make a move, or I can do it in a reactive way, responding to something coming toward me. So I would break it, the predatory versus, which is game and fun, and dopamine learning versus fight or flight. And then fight or flight is you either get out of there or you fight, and your fighting moves then become different based on the environmental situation. That might, just as if you learned any self-defense, you sometimes take an offensive move or a defensive move. You might do defensive because it leads to a better offensive move. I don't see any evidence that we should be thinking of aggression in terms of it's a fear response or it's a defense versus an offense. It's a fight or flight, which is the sympathetic system aroused and working. And once the sympathetic system is aroused and working, your brain is doing complex calculations at quicker than you're thinking about them, about whether it's better to move on or not. And from a sliding scale point of view, you start with threat displays, because if I can get you to do nothing, that's safer than if you do something, right? So that's where you start doing teeth baring and growling and posturing. That's basically, let's not fight right now. It's kind of how countries interact with each other, right? Let's not fight right now. Let's just act tough, because that's a lot safer. And then once the situation warrants, behaviors that say you cross a threshold, I don't see the positive feedback loop that's there. It's usually a ratcheting up, a sliding scale. Neither one backed down, one didn't back down. The other gets more engaged. So it's a different way of thinking about it because, again, from nature's point of view, this is all good stuff. This is all positive because it leads to either more access to resources or more survival in the long run.
And it's a great way to really help us understand our dogs as well, and that it's not, aggression's not a bad thing.
Not from their point. I mean, it can be a painful thing. It can, but it's like saying, is urination good or bad? Well, a dog's got to urinate. On my carpet? No. Out in the yard? Yes. So it's like urination's not good or bad. It's going to happen because you have kidneys. Now it's how well does it fit into my lifestyle? I would argue that aggression by itself is not good or bad. It's what's the setting and what's the result, and it makes a difference.
It's a good analogy. I'm going to have to steal that one because I get that question a lot too. So a couple more questions before we wrap up is, you're going to be talking at the Aggression in Dogs conference this year in October, late September, early October in Chicago, which I'm super looking forward to that. You're going to be doing a talk with Sue Sternberg as well. So do you want to talk more about the 2 talks that you're going to be giving?
Sure. I'm very excited about the talks, and I thank you for the opportunity. They both kind of come out of some conversations with you, Mike, that you and I had at APDT and kind of talking back and forth. This thinking of the biology of aggression as every animal in nature, except for sponges. Sponges are an animal. Except for sponges, they don't have any behaviors. Every other animal has behaviors. They all have forms of aggression. It's a basic evolutionary need in a world of limited resources. And I want to give the biological lens of aggression and different kinds of aggression-associated activities, to see where they come from an evolutionary point of view. Understand that wolf that lives in your house, why it has this set of tools, and how those come into play in nature so that you can start thinking about, well, what am I doing in my house? That actually ties to the second talk. What Sue and I are going to be talking about is how the environment drives a lot of our dog behaviors and trains our dog, right? So my dog learns from the environment. It gets these smells. It learns what these smells do. I'll give you an example. I was at a conference in Miami, and there were 10-ish high rises of 40 or 50 stories each, all around a very small park. And everybody's dogs had to come out there. If they didn't have a pee pad inside, they would come out there for their biological eliminations. And that noise environment of that high rise and that smell environment of the park are constantly training our dogs. And if we're not paying attention to that, they're getting a whole lot of lessons we didn't intend. So we're going to look at some of those environmental cues and impacts. And then Sue will be bringing in the behavior, describing the behaviors and what the dog is doing and what to be watching for. So you can start thinking about how do you out-train the environment. So one talks on the biological lens and looking at aggression. Let's strip away all the negative connotations we use, and let's look at the biology of it. And then the other is looking at how the environment trains the dog, for example, elevates cortisol levels or something like that, and leads to different suites of behaviors.
I'm so looking forward to both of those. It's going to be exciting. It's like the perfect marriage too, with you and Sue doing a talk together. I love that. I love it. So one more final follow-up question here is let's say you have a new class at the university and it's all dog trainers going to be attending and pet guardians having issues with their own dogs. Resources that you would recommend for that class if you were to say, all right, you guys have to learn about biology and aggression.
Yeah. So for the class, if I could pick 2 books, they're both by Alexandra Horowitz. She's fabulous in her writing. Inside a Dog, What Dogs See, Smell, and Know is fantastic. She also did Decoding Your Dog, explaining common dog behaviors and how to prevent and change unwanted ones. I think anything she's written is fantastic. Yeah. But those 2 books, I read those and I was like, she's a behaviorist. She's a behaviorist, but not like dog training behaviors. I mean, that's her science. That's what she studies. And she knows that so well. And she does such a good job putting the biological lens from a behaviorist point of view and understanding what's going on in your dog's head. It's like I take you up to that spot. She takes you beyond that spot. So the third book I recommend, of course, is my book because I don't know of anything else that's out there. It's why I ended up writing the book, to give you the biology of what's going on inside your dog up to that point where we start translating it into behaviors, and then anything by Horowitz is just the way to go. If you want to get into the scientific literature, there's only been one really good study of controlling aggression techniques. It came out in 2021. It's a multiple author one, but Dinwoody did the publications called An Investigation into the Effectiveness of Various Professionals and Behavior Modification Programs with or without medication for the treatment of canine aggression. And using a large sample size, looked at different outcomes from different behavior modification techniques, different physical techniques, different chemical techniques, medications, and nutraceuticals. It is the best study if you want to get into the science of what do we know. But it'll leave you with 10,000 questions that will say, well, we need more funding for science to get some of those answers. Absolutely a great scientific paper. Pretty readable. If you're not into statistics, you can just skip the statistical analysis. But those are the tools I really like to recommend to people.
Excellent. And I'll be sure to link to those in the show notes for everybody as well. Tim, thank you so much for coming on. This has been very, very educational for me, and I'm sure the listeners will agree. And I look forward to seeing you at the conference this year.
Mike, thank you so much for having me on your show. Thanks a lot.
All right. Excellent. I hope you enjoyed this enlightening conversation with Tim as much as I did, and appreciate you tuning in to hear more about the science of biology and how it applies to aggression in dogs and other species as well. And head on over to aggressivedog.com for more information about helping dogs with aggression, from the Aggression in Dogs Master Course to webinars from world-renowned experts and even an annual conference. We have options for both pet pros and pet owners to learn more about aggression in dogs. And don't forget about the Help for Dogs with Aggression bonus episodes that you can subscribe to. These are solo shows where I walk you through how to work with a variety of types of aggression, such as resource guarding, dog-to-dog aggression, territorial aggression, fear-based aggression, and much, much more. You can find a link to subscribe in the show notes or by hitting the subscribe button if you're listening in on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening in, and stay well, my friends.
Boom.